England, a land of misty landscapes and towering stone fortresses. A place where the echoes of kings and peasants alike reverberate through the annals of time, from the fertile fields of the countryside to the stone-paved streets of market towns. This was a world that underwent profound changes, social, economic, and political, that would lay the foundation for the modern world we know today. This was the Middle Ages, spanning nearly 1,000 years, from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th. The Middle Ages were a period of transformation. In these centuries, England evolved from a fractured, war-torn land into a centralized, powerful kingdom. Its people, from noble kings to struggling peasants, navigated vast shifts in power, wealth, and identity as feudalism rose, collapsed, and morphed into the foundations of modern society. But what drove these changes? How did the lives of everyday people, the farmers, the traders, the artisans, intersect with the decisions made by kings and bishops? And what was the cost of this evolution? From the quiet fields where peasants worked to the grand halls where royalty feasted, the forces shaping society and economy were vast, complex, and often unpredictable. Throughout this documentary, we will explore these key questions. How did England's society and economy evolve over the course of the Middle Ages? And what were the key forces, from war and famine to trade and religion, that shaped the lives of its people, from the lowliest serfs to the most powerful kings? We'll take you on a journey through time, examining England's social and economic history, both chronologically and thematically, from the early days of Anglo-Saxon rule to the Norman conquest, from the agricultural life of the peasantry to the rise of thriving market towns, and from the chaos of the Black Death to the wars that shaped a New England. This is a story of revolution, struggle, and resilience. A story of how a once fractured society transformed into a nation that would eventually shape the world. Through this lens, we'll witness how England's medieval society was not a static, unchanging system, but one constantly in flux, constantly being shaped by its people, its rulers, and the forces of nature and history. And just as the land itself was divided by lords and peasants, so too was the economy, a patchwork of manorial estates, bustling towns, and far-reaching trade networks. Join us as we unravel the complex, fascinating history of medieval England, a world of kings and queens, peasants and knights, merchants and scholars. This is the story of how England's social and economic foundations were built, brick by brick, coin by coin, and decision by decision. Welcome to the historical scholia of the social and economic history of England during the Middle Ages. Chapter 1. The early Middle Ages, 5th to 10th century. The year is 410 A.D. The once mighty Roman Empire, whose legions marched from the sands of the Sahara to the distant reaches of Britain, begins to unravel. After centuries of rule, Rome itself is under siege, its once invincible walls now crumbling before barbarian forces. In this moment of crisis, Britain stands abandoned. The Roman legions, pulled back to defend the heart of the empire, leave the Britons to face a turbulent future. The roads, once teeming with trade, begin to fall silent. The cities that once thrived under Roman law and infrastructure start to decay. Without the shield of Rome, Britain becomes a land divided, vulnerable to both internal strife and external threats. As the sun sets on the Roman era, new forces are gathering in the shadows, forces from beyond the seas, driven by the promise of land and fortune. From the shores of what we now call Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, the Anglo-Saxons come. Fierce, resourceful, and determined, they seek a new homeland in this fragile land of Britain. The Anglo-Saxon warriors land on the British coast, their longships cutting through the mist. They see not a deserted land, but a fractured one, ripe for the taking. And so begins the slow, yet inevitable establishment of new kingdoms. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, names that will come to define the new order. But these Anglo-Saxons are not just conquerors. They are settlers, builders, and farmers. They find a land that has been shaped by Roman agriculture and craftsmanship, but now it is theirs to mold. The vast fields, the fertile soil, the remnants of Roman industry, these become the foundation of their new economy. With the fall of Rome, the complexity of the empire's trade networks withers. The grand roads built by Roman hands begin to crack and fade, But life continues in the smaller scale of local economies. Villages grow around the farms, markets become bustling hubs of exchange, and barter systems replace the coinage of the old empire. The old Roman structures are slowly reclaimed by nature, but their influence persists in the foundations of the new Anglo-Saxon way of life. Agriculture flourishes, sheep and cattle graze the rolling hills, and communities form around the essential needs of survival. The peace of the land and the ability to protect it become the driving force of a new order. As the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms rise, they are built on a foundation of kinship, land, and survival. Yet, even in their isolation, the echoes of Rome can still be heard, faintly in the ways that these new kingdoms organize themselves, trade, and govern. The fall of Rome may have shattered an empire, but it set in motion the creation of a new world, a world shaped by the bonds of the local, the regional, and the new kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons. The legacy of Rome may have faded, but the seeds of a new medieval order are now firmly planted in the soil of Britain. As the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms took root in Britain, a new social order began to emerge, one defined not just by kinship and land, but by faith. Christianity, which had begun its quiet spread across the land, would soon become the bedrock upon which much of society was built. It was not just a religion, it became a guiding force in governance, education, and daily life. By the 6th century, monasteries were rising as the focal points of Christian life. In these stone sanctuaries, monks labored in prayer and study, preserving the ancient knowledge of the Roman world and spreading the teachings of Christ. These monastic communities were the intellectual hubs of the time, transcribing manuscripts, offering education, and providing shelter to the poor. The monks, who once sought only solitude, now stood as guardians of knowledge and wisdom. But the rise of Christianity was not only about the salvation of souls. The Church, with its expanding influence, began to shape the very structure of Anglo-Saxon society. Kings, though powerful in their own right, increasingly sought the Church's blessing. In return, the Church extended its power through the clergy, priests, bishops, and abbots, who not only led the faithful, but often served as advisors to kings, mediators in disputes, and even landowners in their own right. Above all, at the top of the social ladder stood the king, revered, powerful, and often seen as divinely appointed. Beneath him, the nobles, or thanes, controlled the land. They were warriors and landholders, bound to the king by loyalty and service. These nobles were the heart of the kingdom's defense, keeping peace and order in the countryside. Yet, there were those below them, living in stark contrast. The serfs, tied to the land they worked, were at the bottom of the social pyramid. Their lives were defined by toil, often working the fields of the nobles or the church, with little to call their own. These peasants were the backbone of the economy, yet their status was one of servitude. Their existence was dictated by the rhythms of nature and the will of those who ruled over them. The church, however, did not only watch over the elite, it extended its reach to the common folk as well. It offered charity, providing food, shelter, and care for the poor, the sick, and the needy. Its monasteries became sanctuaries for the destitute, where acts of kindness and mercy were carried out in the name of Christ. Education, once reserved for the aristocracy, began to spread through the church. Monasteries became schools of learning, where both clergy and lay people could be taught to read and write. The clergy, often the most literate people in the land, were the keepers of knowledge. They transcribed ancient texts, keeping the intellectual traditions of the past alive for future generations. In every village, in every kingdom, the church played an undeniable role. It was present in every important moment of life, from birth and baptism to marriage and death. It governed not just the soul, but also the social fabric. Even kings bowed before the spiritual authority of the church, recognizing that their reigns, too, were part of a divine plan. As Christianity grew in power, so too did the church's influence over governance. Bishops and abbots, with their control over vast estates, became not only spiritual leaders, but political ones, guiding kings and nobles alike. The lines between the sacred and the secular were often blurred, and in many ways, they were one and the same. This was a world where power was shared between the throne and the altar, where every person, whether king, noble, or serf, was touched by the hand of the church. It was a world where faith governed the actions of men and women, shaping the structures of their lives and the course of their history. And so, with the church as both spiritual and temporal guide, the Anglo-Saxon world would begin to craft a new identity. one that would endure for centuries to come. The year is 793 AD, and the quiet peace of Anglo-Saxon Britain is about to be shattered. From the north, across the cold waters of the North Sea, come the Vikings, warriors from Scandinavia, driven by the lure of wealth, land, and adventure. Their longships, sleek and fast, cut through the waves like predators on the hunt. It begins with a raid on Lindisfarne, a wealthy monastery on the northeastern coast. The peaceful monks are caught off guard, their sacred home ransacked and burned. This first attack signals the start of a series of brutal Viking raids that will bring destruction to towns, villages, and monasteries across Britain. These raids, swift and merciless, shatter the economic stability that the Anglo-Saxons had carefully built over generations. The Vikings, fierce and relentless, strike at the heart of Anglo-Saxon trade and agriculture. Coastal towns that once thrived with commerce are looted and abandoned. The markets that once bustled with the exchange of wool, grain, pottery, and iron go silent, their merchants scattered in fear. The very lifeblood of the kingdom, its people, its goods, its economy, now hangs in the balance. But even in the face of such destruction, something new begins to emerge from the chaos. The Vikings, as feared as they were also settlers, driven by more than just plunder. As they move inland and settle in regions of Britain, they begin to lay down roots. They don't just conquer, they establish new homes, create farms, and forge new communities. And in doing so, they alter the very fabric of British society. In the territories under Viking control, which would become known as the Danelaw, a gradual integration takes place. Viking warriors marry Anglo-Saxon women, and over time, both sides learn from one another. New settlements emerge, where Viking and Anglo-Saxon cultures blend. The Vikings bring with them new technologies, advanced shipbuilding, ironworking, and agricultural practices, while the Anglo-Saxons share their knowledge of the land and local governance. This cultural exchange doesn't stop at trade and technology. It extends to language, law, and customs. Over generations, the distinction between Viking invader and Anglo-Saxon becomes less clear. Words of Old Norse begin to weave into the Anglo-Saxon language, and Viking art, with its distinctive patterns and motifs, mingles with Anglo-Saxon craftsmanship. Families from both cultures share land and resources, and slowly, the two worlds merge into a new, more complex society. Though the Viking raids began with fear and bloodshed, they ultimately lead to a fusion of cultures that reshapes Britain. The Vikings, once feared as conquerors, become an integral part of the kingdom they invaded. What started as an age of terror transforms into an age of settlement and exchange, a time when two peoples, once divided by war, come together to create a new world. The Viking invasions are remembered for their violence, but their long-term impact on Britain was profound. From the ashes of destruction rose a new, more diverse society, one that would carry the legacies of both the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, forever changing the course of British history. Chapter 2. The High Middle Ages, 11th to 13th century. In the year 1066, England stood on the brink of monumental change. King Harold Godwinson, having ascended to the throne after the death of Edward the Confessor, ruled a land at peace, but a threat loomed from across the English Channel, in Normandy. There, Duke William, later known as William the Conqueror, claimed a right to the English throne. A contest of wills, fate, and bloodshed would soon unfold. The stage was set for the Battle of Hastings. Harold, freshly crowned king, faced an invading force, William's Norman army, well organized and determined. On October 14th, 1066, the two armies met in a clash that would change the course of English history forever. The Battle of Hastings was fierce. Harold's forces, exhausted from earlier battles, fought valiantly. But William's army, with its superior tactics and cavalry, broke through. Harold was struck down, his death signaling the end of Anglo-Saxon rule and the beginning of Norman domination. With Harold's death, William claimed victory, but the battle was more than a conquest of land. It was the dawn of a new political system. Feudalism, a structure of land distribution, and loyalty would become the foundation of Norman rule. The conquest wasn't just military, it was social and economic. The Normans would now govern England through a system where loyalty to the crown was rewarded with land and power. To solidify his hold on England, William ordered a comprehensive survey, the Domesday Book, This monumental task catalogued every piece of land, every resource, and every landholder in the kingdom. It was a way for William to assess his new kingdom, ensure that it was properly taxed, and guarantee his control over every aspect of his domain. With the land mapped and catalogued, William redistributed it. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was displaced, and in their place, Norman lords were granted fiefs, vast tracts of land that bound them to the king in loyalty and military service. This redistribution of land cemented William's power and established the roots of feudalism in England. At the heart of this new order was the manor. The lord of each manor, whether Anglo-Saxon or Norman, controlled the land and the people who worked it. Serfs and peasants bound to the land they tilled made up the backbone of this system. In exchange for their labor, the lord offered protection, but life under manorialism was one of hard work and limited freedom. The manor was a microcosm of the rigid social structure that defined medieval life, with each class of people playing a specific role in maintaining its function. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the serfs, often born into their status and bound to the land they worked. They had little freedom and were obligated to work the lord's fields for several days each week, typically 3 to 5, depending on the lord's customs. In return, the lord provided them with a small plot of land for their own use, offering the bare minimum needed to feed their families. While serfs were not slaves, they were far from free. Their obligations were tied to the land, and they could not leave without the lord's consent. Above the serfs were the freemen, a class that enjoyed more privileges. These individuals had more independence and could own property, engage in trade, and, in some cases, serve as skilled craftsmen or merchants. However, even freemen owed certain obligations to the lord. While they were not bound to the manor as the serfs were, they were still required to perform services for the lord, such as military service or payment of rent. In exchange, they were granted a degree of freedom, a place to live, and the right to cultivate land without the heavy burdens placed upon the serfs. At the other end of the spectrum were the wards, young nobles or heirs who were placed under the guardianship of a lord until they came of age. These wards were often treated as honored guests in the lord's household, and their care and upbringing were an important responsibility for the lord. In return for raising and protecting a ward, the lord could claim loyalty and fealty from the ward's family, often solidifying future alliances. Slaves, though less common in later medieval England, still existed in some regions, particularly in the earlier centuries. Slaves had no rights and were considered property, often captured during raids or born into servitude. Their labor was strictly for their master's benefit, with no personal autonomy or land of their own. The obligations of slaves were absolute, with no expectation of return beyond the barest sustenance, such as food and shelter. The obligations and responsibilities between the different classes were governed by custom and necessity. Lords were expected to provide protection and justice in exchange for the services of those beneath them. The serfs, for example, worked the fields in exchange for the lord's promise of safety, a roof over their heads, and the right to live off the land they tilled. Meanwhile, freemen could negotiate for better terms, perhaps offering specialized skills in return for slightly less labor or increased rights. The relationship between the lord and his people, while steeped in hierarchy, was one of mutual reliance, dictated by centuries of tradition, custom, and the needs of the manor. The structure was clear, and although some may have dreamed of a better life, it was a system that provided stability, at least for the lords who ruled over it. The everyday lives of those working the land were shaped by obligations, both to their lords and their families, as they navigated the harsh realities of medieval existence. As Norman castles rose across the English landscape, marking the dominance of their new rulers, England's rural life became deeply shaped by the demands of feudalism. Each manor, with its peasants, its crops, and its obligations, became a unit of production and control. The old Anglo-Saxon ways gave way to this new order, where loyalty, land, and labor formed the foundation of society. The Norman conquest was not just a military victory, it was a reorganization of life itself. And through it, William the Conqueror reshaped England into a kingdom where the land and its people were bound by an unbreakable chain of feudal obligation, a system that would define England for centuries to come. As the 12th century unfolds, a new economic landscape begins to take shape across England. With the rise of towns and the growing importance of trade, the foundations of a new social order are being built. No longer solely reliant on the feudal system of land and labor, England's economy begins to thrive in new and unexpected ways. The towns, once small and humble centers of local life, start to grow in size and significance. These bustling market towns emerge as the heartbeat of commerce, drawing people from the countryside who seek a better life in trade, craftsmanship, and business. The rise of the merchant class, those who deal in goods ranging from grain and wool to spices and silk, marks the beginning of an economic revolution. In these towns, the market square becomes a place of activity and opportunity. Merchants hailing from both local villages and distant lands set up stalls brimming with goods. Woolen textiles from England, fine pottery from the continent, fresh produce, and exotic goods from far-flung parts of the world are exchanged for coins and favors. The market not only serves as a place of trade, but also as a meeting point for the people of the town, where connections are made and fortunes are forged. At the heart of this economic surge are the guilds, organizations of merchants, craftsmen, and tradespeople who regulate their industries and protect their interests. These guilds set standards for quality, ensure fair wages, and provide social support for their members. Whether it is a guild of blacksmiths, weavers, or merchants, these groups create a sense of order in the burgeoning urban economy and help protect their members from outside competition. As these towns expand, the networks of trade grow ever more intricate. Goods once limited to local markets are now being exchanged across regions, countries, and even continents. Ships laden with wine, grain, and luxuries from the Mediterranean dock at port towns, while caravans carrying textiles, spices, and fine goods travel from one market to the next. The towns of England are now linked to a wider European and even global economy, with trade routes that connect the medieval world in ways never before seen. The impact of these market towns is profound. They offer opportunities for those outside the traditional feudal system, craftsmen, merchants, and laborers alike, to find prosperity and rise in status. Towns begin to develop their own sense of identity and autonomy, often gaining special privileges from the monarchy in exchange for taxes and military service. No longer are they merely extensions of the countryside. They are self-sustaining communities, driven by the commerce that takes place within their walls. With the rise of towns comes the expansion of infrastructure. New roads are built to facilitate the movement of goods. New stone buildings replace the old wooden structures, signifying the town's permanence and importance. The physical landscape begins to reflect the changing economic realities, as town squares become centers of commerce and craft, while marketplaces grow larger, more organized, and more diverse. The growth of towns and the creation of a merchant class shift the balance of power in England. No longer are the great lords and their manors the sole centers of wealth and influence. Towns and their merchants challenge the traditional feudal hierarchy, offering a new path to prosperity. A man no longer needs to be born into nobility to find wealth. He need only have goods to trade and a sharp mind for business. This expanding economy has a lasting impact on society. As towns grow, they foster a new middle class of merchants and tradesmen, individuals whose wealth and influence come not from land, but from their ability to navigate the world of commerce. And as trade and craftsmanship continue to flourish, so too does the dynamic and ever-evolving world of medieval England. Beyond the castles and growing towns, the vast majority of England's population, peasants and serfs, lived a life of toil and hardship. The medieval world was built on the labor of those who worked the land, and their lives were shaped by the harsh demands of the feudal system. For most, freedom was a distant dream. They were bound to the soil, tied to the land of their lords. At the heart of this rural world was the system of serfdom. Serfs, unlike slaves, were not owned by their lords, but were bound to the land they worked. They had little control over their own lives, and their days were filled with backbreaking labor, plowing fields, harvesting crops, and performing other tasks that sustained the manor. In exchange, they were given a small plot of land to grow their own food and offered a modicum of protection, but their lives were far from easy. Their lord held dominion over their labor, often requiring them to work the lord's land for several days a week, leaving them with little time for themselves. The serfs' rights were minimal, and any attempt to leave the land was punishable. They were not slaves, but their lack of freedom made little difference to the life they led. The manor, with its fields, crops, and animals, was both their prison and their livelihood. For peasants living in the villages, life was no better. Though not all were serfs, the vast majority depended on their lords for land to farm and for protection. In exchange, they worked the land, giving a portion of their harvest to the lord as rent or tax. The rest of their lives were dedicated to subsistence farming, growing enough food to feed their families and provide a small surplus for trade, often at great personal sacrifice. In these harsh conditions, there was little room for hope. The peasants were subject to the whims of their lords, forced to pay high taxes, and often faced with cruel punishments for minor offenses. They lived in small thatched cottages that were barely adequate for survival, surrounded by the ever-present threat of famine, disease, and war. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, wiped out entire communities, further deepening the misery of those left behind. Yet, despite their hardships, the spirit of resistance was never far from the surface. As the burdens of serfdom and the weight of heavy taxation grew, peasants began to rise up. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 stands as the most dramatic example of this discontent. Sparking from the imposition of new taxes, especially the poll tax, the revolt saw thousands of peasants, led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, march to London demanding justice. The revolt, though ultimately suppressed, was a moment of defiance, a moment where the peasants dared to challenge the very system that had oppressed them for centuries. The crowds that gathered in London stormed the gates of the Tower, demanding an end to serfdom and the right to live with dignity. The king, Richard II, met with the leaders of the revolt, promising reforms to calm the unrest. But the promises proved hollow, and in the end, many of the rebels were executed, their hopes dashed by the harsh realities of feudal power. The peasants' revolt may have ended in failure, but it marked a turning point. It sent a message to the ruling class that the peasants, though oppressed, were not powerless. Their grievances would not be easily ignored, and their desire for change would not be extinguished. Life for the lower classes in rural and urban settings remained grueling and difficult. But beneath the surface of daily labor, the seeds of change had been sown. The revolt was a spark, a moment that would inspire future generations to challenge the rigid social structures of medieval society. And though the struggles of the peasants were far from over, the memory of their resistance lived on. This was part one of Historical Scholia's three-part documentary on the social and economic history of England during the Middle Ages. In part one, we covered 1. The fall of Rome and the arrival of Anglo-Saxons. 2. Social structure and the role of the Church. 3. The Viking invasions. 4. The Norman conquest and feudalism. 5. The growth of towns and markets. 6. The role of the peasantry and serfdom. In part 2, we will cover the medieval economy, 13th to 15th century, and social structures and daily life. In part 3, we will cover conflict, war, and economic change and the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the Renaissance.